I think we'll start. Sound good to everyone? All right. So welcome friends and family to the education series, Vermont Truth and Reconciliation education series, narratives from history to present day. And thank you so much. The session today is families of people with disabilities. And before I get too far into the agenda for today and introduce myself, I'd like to go over some of the accessibility resources that we have. We have ASL interpreters with us today, Eric Darius and Hannah Gant. I hope I'm saying your last names correctly. And they are spotlighted for us. We also have closed caption option available. And to access that, you want to move your cursor to the lower right where it says CC tab. Click on that, and you can choose your access to the closed captions there. If you have other communication needs, please indicate those in the chat and one of the team members will respond to you immediately. And we'll do our best to make sure that this session is accessible to you. If you have any recommendations around accessibility, we also ask you to send us an email at VTRC@vermont.gov. And if someone could put that in the chat for me, I'd appreciate that. And let us know what some recommendations you may have. Note on recording, the session is being recorded, and that is for folks who are unable to attend today. That will be linked to our YouTube page and will go up shortly after today. So welcome everyone. My name is Faith Yakubian. I use she, her, they, their pronouns. I am wearing a dark shirt with a dark cardigan. I have my hair down. I'm wearing glasses. I am the executive director of the Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And on behalf of the Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I welcome you to our 5th education series panel session for today. And it is a deep honor, to welcome our distinguished guests, our distinguished panelists and our guests. Our panelists for today's Ed series, Kirsten Isgro, Kristen Murphy, and Beth Davis. Each of them has extensive knowledge and experiences advocating for their family members with disabilities and advocating for themselves as primary caretakers. The education series is distinctive. It is not a public meeting. The education series is about expanding our understanding and our hearts. It is not an open meeting, which is different than what you've noticed in our public meetings. The commissioners will not vote on proposals. We'll answer questions today. But questions for the VTRC can be submitted to VTRC@vermont.gov. You'll notice the commissioners are present, and the rest of the Vermont Truth and Reconciliation team is here as well. And commissioners, would you like to say a hello, just give a greeting? Love to hear you.
Yep, just thank you everyone for being here, and I so look forward to learning tonight. So my name is Melody Mackin, and I use she and her pronouns, and I'm one of the commissioners. Thank you.
Hey, everybody, this is Mia Schultz, she, her pronouns. I am one of the other commissioners. Thank you all for joining us. And I too am excited about learning more today. And yeah, thanks for everybody for attending.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Schultz and Mackin. Audience participation in the panel session is paramount to these series, and they will occur. You will all be invited to ask questions and engage with the panelists towards the end of the session. We ask that you closely reflect on the panelists' offerings and wisdom as you consider questions that you'd like to ask. And we ask that your questions invite further dialogue versus closing down conversation. Before we discuss the purpose of the series and introduce the panelists, I want to review our schedule for our time together. And if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. So our agenda for today, we will head into our land acknowledgement, our pledge and about civility, our goals for the education series, ways to stay connected, and then we will head into the panel discussion and then questions for the panelists from the audience, and then we'll have a closing. Next, I'll read our land acknowledgement. So the land acknowledgement and our pledge are elements of our public meeting that we use routinely as they ground the work that we do. We must acknowledge that Vermont is part of the homeland of the Mohican people and the Alnuba and the Western Abenaki people. We are all part of the circle of creation, and the health of our human communities has an impact on our relations, human and non-human. We want to take this moment to recognize the land itself, Mother Earth, and the many blessings that we are given. We hope you will take the time to think about your relationship to place and what land means to you. And now our pledge. As we explore complex and challenging topics such as race, disability, oppression, and discrimination, we collectively pledge to approach these discussions with a commitment to extend grace, humility, empathy with each other. We recognize that we are all on both an individual and collective journey to dismantle oppression and discrimination from our culture and systems. Therefore, we pledge to cultivate dignity and respect even in moments that we engage. Sorry, this happens a lot. Therefore, we pledge to cultivate dignity and respect even in moments of disagreement and discomfort. You'd think I'd had this memorized by now. We expect and accept non-closure, and with that, we engage in courageous conversations with curiosity and an open mind. We dedicate ourselves to refrain from judgment, embrace active listening, and use I statements to foster open communication. In this space, we understand the platinum rule, where we pledge to abide by each other's unique preferences, thereby building better relationships and collaboration. We come into this with good intentions, but also recognize that even when we do not intend to do harm, there is an impact. And we commit to prioritizing Act 120 communities and acknowledge that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle. Our lives are always interconnected. We vow to treat each other, our stories and dreams and struggles with sacred care. And we honor vulnerability. We embrace the spirit of co-creation. We affirm that we are active agents of change, and we are committed to doing the work to create understanding amongst and with each other. The journey to collective liberation is filled with discomfort and painful truths. But the final destination is community where everyone can thrive together. This is a shared space grounded in the principles of this pledge. Next slide, please. Thank you, Anne. The goals for our ED series: to educate the broader community about the history and present day realities of persons discriminated by the state of Vermont, to outreach to communities to broaden Vermont Truth and Reconciliation's partnerships and expand community participation. Lastly, to educate community and advocate for issues and evolve knowledge on complex issues involving human rights and social systems that impact them. And you can stop sharing. Oh, actually, yes, this one. Don't stop sharing yet. Ways to stay connected. Before I introduce the panelists, I want to make sure that folks know that there's other opportunities to stay connected to the Vermont Truth and Reconciliation. You can visit our website to review the panelist bios, and I do ask that you do. These are extraordinary individuals. And also to find our YouTube once we have that up. Join us for their next panel session on September 25th, which will cover. I need to change that to the title is not Experiences of People with Disabilities. That is today. I apologize. I will change that. We will be focusing on French Canadians or Franco-Americans. I apologize for that mistake. Please fill out our survey, which will help us advance and do better in our education series. You can do that as well. One other way to stay connected to us is to offer feedback. And then lastly, there's a link to get involved on our website. You can choose which of the communities you fall into and how you may want to be involved, which I hope you will do. And now you can stop sharing. Thank you, Anne. I'd like to welcome and introduce our panelists, or actually they will be introducing themselves. It is with great pleasure and gratitude that I welcome our panelists today. Their bios, again, are in the website. We have Kirsten Murphy with us, and Kirsten Isgro, and Beth Davis. I invite them to introduce themselves with their names and pronouns, and anything they'd like to say, and they can mirror their bios. Also, they may decide that they want to say other important things, and so we will accept that with gratitude. Beth, would you like to start?
Sure. Can you hear me? Am I muted? You can
No,
hear
you're
me.
good.
Okay. All right. I can't tell by looking at this. My name is Beth Davis. I live in Addison County in Shoreham. I don't know if you know where Shoreham is. It's south of Middlebury. Um, my husband and I have 3 children, and one of whom has a developmental disability, an adult child who lives with us. I'm retired. I'm a retired tax accountant. I've been involved in many different organizations that have to do with the people with disabilities and other types of organizations too. Can't even remember what I put on my bio, so I don't know what if I'm saying anything close to that at all. But it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Beth.
Happy to jump in next. I'm Kirsten Murphy. I use she, her pronouns. And by way of a visual description, I am an older woman with short salt and pepper hair, mostly salt at this point. I am wearing very dark rimmed large glasses and wearing a blue and white striped shirt. I am here primarily because I am the executive director of something called the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council. We reside within state government, but the DD Council is a public board that consists of 60% people who have a developmental disability or are family members of someone with a developmental disability. We were created by federal law, by Congress, through the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act, and Congress created a DD Council for every state and territory in the nation. I've had the honor of working with the Vermont Council since 2015. Prior to that, I was a member of the New Hampshire Council. I raised my family in New Hampshire. I was a member of the DD Council there for another 10 years. And currently I also serve as the board chair for the National Association of Councils on Developmental Disabilities, which gives me the privilege of having more of a national perspective. I don't say this very often in my role as executive director, but and that's really my primary role here, but I am also the parent of 2 young adults, not so young anymore, honestly. They're 32 and 30. They think they're very old. Who have developmental disabilities. I have 3 children, but my oldest 2, a son and daughter, have developmental disabilities. They are fully grown, live in other states, live pretty independently, work full time. And they're perfectly capable of and have their own opinions about the journey that we went through together as they were growing up. But because of that experience, I am acutely aware of the challenges that families like mine face in navigating maddeningly dysfunctional government systems and advocating that our children have authentic choices and high expectations and ambitious goals. And in facing, frankly, what is a public shunning that occurs often for an ableist society, not only for our children, but for families as a whole. So I will leave it at that, and I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Kirsten?
Still muted.
I'm going to unmute you. Let's see. There you go.
I got trapped there. Couldn't unmute myself. Hi, I'm Kirsten Isgro. I am a resident of Burlington, Vermont. I have twin daughters that are 18 years old. One who just started at the University of Vermont. My other daughter has a rare neurological disorder, seizure disorder, is nonverbal, and is reliant on other people 24/7 to feed and do custodial care for her. I'm also a professor of communication at the State University of New York, and I also teach at the University of Vermont in the health science program. So this journey that I've been on has been an interesting combination, both professionally and personally, as a communication professor and also someone who looks at health communication and patient provider communication, and have ample real life stories that I'm able to bring into the classroom and with the practitioners and clinicians that I work with. I'm also the project director of a grant-driven project that is housed with the Vermont Developmental Disability Council. I'm working very closely with Kirsten. It's called the Inclusive Healthcare Partnership Project, and it started in 2017. We've got a number of different grants, federal, state grants, really looking at the health disparities of people with disabilities. And the project we're working on right now is twofold. We're creating visual health information for adults with developmental and intellectual disabilities using a cartoon artist out of the Center for Cartoon Studies. And the second piece of that is doing some trainings and conversations with clinicians in terms of ways that they can improve their communication with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I've also served on the Patient and Family Advisory Council for the University of Vermont Medical Center's Children's Hospital for 7 years, and have been involved with the Vermont Family Network. And most recently just stepped down from the national board from the Academy of Communication and Healthcare. So that's sort of a snapshot professionally. I would say that I was inclined to be an activist prior to becoming a parent of a child with a disability. I know a lot of parents end up becoming what they call accidental activists. There was nothing accidental about what happened in my life and in my journey, but I am glad that I have the support and community that I have to walk with me in this journey of being a parent with a child with a profound disability. And I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Kirsten and Beth, it's a pleasure to have the three of you here. I feel like I've already learned so much. We can just wrap up now. We have questions, prepared questions that the three of you were generous enough to guide me in creating. So what we'll do is I'll ask one question at a time. We have technically a time limit. That said, I want to be very loose with that. The three of you, each of you have quite a lot to talk about and speak profoundly and very sort of thoughtfully about. So I don't want to limit you. Just know that. We'll just keep in mind that there is, we want to we want the public to also speak. So I'll start with the three. We'll put them also in the chat. First question: please discuss state or federal acts or decisions that have negatively impacted families due to the lack of compliance or failed implementation, and then also the impact on those acts and decisions, please. And Beth, I think you had opted to go first.
Thanks again, Faith, and thank you to the Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Commission for allowing us to speak to these issues, because I have to tell you that as a family member of a person with a developmental disability, we oftentimes feel very invisible. Many times, and that's nobody's fault necessarily, but to have you include us in this panel is a wonderful thing for us to let us tell our stories. So thank you for that. So I'm probably older than anybody in this entire panel and entire Zoom. And during my lifetime, we've seen a lot of things happen in the area of developmental disabilities. Much progress has been made, actually. Our country went from zero protections for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities to the many rules that we have today. When I was in school many decades ago, children with disabilities were segregated. We never saw them. Then in 1975, which I remember well, I was in college at the time, Public Law 94-142 was passed. which guaranteed a free and public education for children with disabilities. Later, this became the IDEA Act, which required public schools to provide a free and appropriate education to eligible children in the least restrictive environment that is appropriate for their needs. The LRE is one that allows the child to interact with non-disabled students as much as possible. Separate schooling was only allowed when the disability severity or nature made it impossible to achieve instructional goals in the regular classroom. Then in 1999, the Supreme Court decided in the Olmstead case that segregating people with disabilities was a form of discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that is a lot that has happened in those many decades. What was happening during Vermont at that time? Well, the Brandon Training School was opened in 1915 to provide care for individuals with disabilities. And although it was built to address the needs of individuals with disabilities, the common practice of eugenics, which isolated them from the community and included involuntary sterilization, came under increasing scrutiny in light of the disabilities rights movements and the court cases in the late 20th century. Now, in 1993, which was before the Olmstead decision, the state of Vermont decided to close the Brandon Training School to stop the practice of segregating people with disabilities and to allow them to live in the community. 2,324 people lived at the Brandon Training School between 1915 and 1993. When the school was closed, families were assured that the residents of the Brandon Training School would be cared for by the state of Vermont. The plan was to integrate individuals with disabilities into their local community, primarily by having them live with shared living providers. And originally, most of those home providers were former staff from the Brandon Training School. This seemed like a great solution. And for some people, it was a good solution. A friend of mine had a very different situation. She had a cousin who lived at the Brandon Training School. And when the school closed, a home provider could not be found for her. And she was forced to move in with her elderly father, who was verbally abusive toward her. Now, over time, there were more and more people, as we know, diagnosed with developmental disabilities. But the number of home providers dwindled. I mean, think about it. In 1993, there were a lot more people than there were jobs. Now it's the other way around. So now it's not that inviting for someone to want to become a shared living provider. Not only that, according to the 2023 research brief commissioned by Act 186, the state of Vermont needs to create 602 new units of supported housing to meet the needs of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities who receive home and community-based services. It's a lot of people. So what's happening with those people? If there aren't enough home providers, they live with their parents. That's where they are. That's where they're living. And these are aging parents. These are baby boomer parents. These are parents who are not going to be able to do this for a lot longer. The promise by Governor Dean back in 1993 that all of Vermont's individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities would be taken care of after the closing of the Brandon Training School needs to be honored by our state government. And as of now, it is not.
Wow.
Tag, you're it, Kirsten.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you for that. Beth and I didn't really plan it this way, but when we talked this morning, I realized that I'm going to just take up the story that Beth started. And I'll be a little bit longer on this question and not a bit more concise on the next two, so bear with me. I want to point to two bodies of work, each mandated by the federal government, where I believe Vermont very much failed to realize in concrete and substantial ways the promise and vision of living in the community, of what community inclusion truly means. So one of the phrases we use a lot at the council when we're talking with executive branch officials is, hey, let the federal government work for you. In other words, sometimes the federal government can mandate things that a state does not have the political will to do. And that can be a really useful strategy sometimes when you're trying to do something that's just not going to be popular among people elected with, tight budgets and a tax-conscious group of constituents. But in these two instances, I believe the state instead delayed and diminished the outcomes that were sought by federal agencies. So Beth mentioned the Supreme Court's Olmstead VLC decision. Pretty shortly thereafter that 1999 decision, the Bush administration, this is the George W. Bush administration, a Republican administration, announced the creation of the New Freedom Initiative, followed by an executive order, and this was 2001. The order instructed the federal government through numerous host agencies to assist states and localities in swiftly implementing Olmstead and the goals of Title II under the Americans with Disabilities Act, as the court had required. Like 42 other states and the District of Columbia, Vermont created an Olmstead Commission in 2002 that did its work between 2002 and 2006. And to read the list of the commission members, it still reads like a who's who of disability champions. Many of them are still disability champions. They are well-known names to our community. And I can only assume that they all had the very best of intentions. But there were some decisions made at that time that I think put us on a really disadvantageous trajectory. In the enabling statute that the Vermont legislature passed, they really pointed to the possibilities ahead, finding that Vermont has the opportunity to plan its own future and reduce its vulnerability to claims that it discriminates against Vermonters with disabilities by developing a comprehensive, effective working plan, end quote. In fact, the statute charges the commission with developing a plan to ensure that people with disabilities are placed in the most integrated settings, and moreover, that the commission was to propose to the General Assembly a long-term financial plan supporting the implementation of that placement plan that included anticipated revenues and expenditures by state agency and community organization, recommendations for aligning revenues and expenditures, and any other recommendations or information needed to ensure that the placement plan is financially sustainable. Now, Vermont did not have a lot of people in institutional type settings. That would be nursing homes, what they call ICFs, intermediate care facilities, even arguably certain types of group homes. So, because we'd already shut down our state institution, right? But the commission in Vermont chose to expand the community that it looked at beyond the small number of people, relatively small, in those institutional settings, and to talk about the need for ongoing placement and availability of placement for people who are at risk of institutionalization. And that is a much bigger population, I would argue, includes lots of the people that are served by the Developmental Disabilities Services System and even those served by Choices for Care. People who, for want of consistent, trained, supportive staff and appropriate living situations could be in a nursing home. Having made the decision to look at that wider population, however, the story then gets harder to understand, because the commission decided to then kind of rein in the amount of the kind of recommendations that it published. And when its plan came out in 2006, the Olmstead Plan, a living document in many states, a plan that in our state has not been revisited since 2006 and largely sits on a shelf, it declared that, quote, the approach that Vermont has taken in the development of its Olmsted Plan is largely different from other states. And by its own description, instead, what we got was a catalog of needs related to community integration, needs in housing, needs in transportation, needs in family support, and, quote, a tool for planning and prioritizing of state resources to support its citizens with disabilities and those who are elders. So what we got was a catalog of problems and a tool that could be used in setting priorities. But that tool was set on a shelf, and that tool was never actually used effectively by our legislature, nor was there what we really need, which is a roadmap towards sustained investment, which is what other states do, in the infrastructure necessary to make community living actually happen. That's housing, that's an educated workforce, that's agencies that oversee that workforce. So what we've ended up with is the story that Beth has just told you, a narrow range of community-based options, very narrow, much more narrow than in other states, and a deteriorating care infrastructure. Now, there's another chapter in this story, and that has to do with what the Federal Medicaid Authority did in response to the Olmsted decision. So, like a good federal bureaucracy, which I got to tell you, Medicaid really is. And you'll hear me use the word CMS, the phrase CMS. That's code for Medicaid, the Federal Medicaid Office. They spent a number of years parsing out what it was that they meant by community living. Because if that was a category of spend for federal Medicaid dollars, they needed to be able to define what was an allowable activity or setting and what was not an allowable activity or setting. So, like a big federal bureaucracy, they spent several years engaged in stakeholder conversations, accepting public comment. And there's an important footnote here, actually, for Vermont. A seminal paper was provided by the Administration for Community Living. That's the federal bureaucracy that I actually report to. They put together a paper that is titled Keeping the Promise, Self-Advocates Defining the Meaning of Community Living. And there were several Vermonters that helped author that paper. And it remains really kind of pivotal in how the Federal Medicaid Authority defined community living. And what the folks that wrote that paper came together and shared was it's not about the building. It's not so much about where. It's very, very much about the quality of the life that someone can enjoy when they are receiving home and community-based services. That's what makes or breaks whether something is truly community living, right? Um, and that's an idea that then ran through a whole series of rules that CMS, the Federal Medicaid Authority, has promulgated since 2014. And these rules have come in waves. The first wave was in 2014. It's known as the Person-Centered Planning Rule, and it had two parts to it. It said that if someone is eligible for these home and community-based services, a specific category of Medicaid spend, they must have, we will only pay for services that are based on a person-centered plan. And that's a set of best practices that actually Vermont does okay with. But second, they also must be delivered in a way free from conflicts of interest or undue conflicts of interest. And in fact, that is something that Vermont's system was very much rife with. Not because of any malfeasance or anything. We were early out of the gate closing our institution. So when we created our system, we created what I call a vertically integrated system. From soup to nuts, you got everything from your agency, right? That sounds attractive, except that it builds in a lot of inherent conflicts of interest, where the person who plans your services and decides if you're eligible and controls the information that families and you might get about services and every other aspect of that complicated process is also the provider of the services themselves. And that really does not work to the benefit of the individuals or the families. And there are abundant evidence of that that's been collected. The state's response is instructive, though. The state's response in 2014 was to say, that rule, that doesn't actually apply to Vermont. And they begged off for several years, saying, well, we use a specific type of agreement with Medicaid, and that agreement isn't bound by this rule, even though if you'd spent 5 minutes in Washington, D.C., you were well aware at the conferences I go to that it was every intent that it would apply to all states. So first, it didn't apply. Then it applied, but Vermont went through a very lengthy process to develop an argument why it should be waived in the case of Vermont. And CMS said, thank you very much. We're not waiving this. So almost 10 years after this rule became live, the state of Vermont was placed under a corrective action plan by the Federal Medicaid Authority, and it has until 2026, March of 26, to fully come into compliance in standing up an independent case management entity or entities so that your planning of services is separate and is going to therefore better reflect the needs of the individual and their family caregivers. And there are additional things that the state still has yet to do. Eligibility for clinical eligibility also has to be removed from the provider agencies, and that piece is still a little ambiguous. So there's some of us watching that process, but it will have been well more than 10 years. Let me do the math. So, 12 years by the time we truly address those conflicts of interest that have a direct bearing on the quality of life of the individuals served. Second wave of CMS rules was long delayed by the Trump administration, unfortunately, but did come online in March of 2022, and those are referred to as the settings rules. And there are a number of things that talk about what a setting can look like if Medicaid is going to pay for it. And there are a lot of fairly specific rules that apply to individual rights when they are in a provider-owned and controlled setting, like a group home or like a shared living situation, which is so common in Vermont. And they have things to do with like being able to have food at any time you want, or guests, or a choice about whether you want to use a lock on your door, but you have to have one available. Things that typically were not happening in home provider situations because they are more of a foster care model. At any rate, again, this is a place where Vermont's working hard to come into compliance, but where it has not stepped up, and this concerns me very much, is the overarching principle of the settings rule is that individuals are entitled to authentic choice and options in the residential setting where they received their services. And between the lack of shared living providers and the lack of any model other than that, people are often only told you have one place you can go, take it or leave it. And that is not what we have been promised. And that is a direct failure of the state, I'm afraid, to implement, an important rule that will help mitigate the impact on families like Beth's, who are, getting up there in age and still have someone living at home. So I think that's enough from me.
Kirsten, thanks. Thank you so much. I do have a question before we go to Kirsten. I hope that's okay, Kirsten.
Absolutely.
Thank you. As a follow-up, Kirsten, there must be some form of benefit to the state, or else why would they create such limitations around the tier, so around the conflict of interest? Can you speak to that?
The conflict of interest, I think, was that when you have contractor agencies who are used to being able to bill for service coordination, they would be put in economic jeopardy if that was taken away from them, unless the state works with them to figure out a way to damp down that financial impact. So that would be one thing. Also, I think sort of, in the big picture, the state said, whoa, we have to stand up a whole new set of, case management entities. Where are we going to get the money for that? think it was mostly about the money, but I think that there was a lot of rumors flying around, and there were plenty of people who were also really scared. Hey, I'm used to getting this done one way, and I don't know if I want to change. But from a rights perspective, which is where we come from at the council, it was very much in people's interest to have their rights protected.
Of course. Thank you, Kristen. Sorry, Kirsten, and thank you for that.
Oh, no
Would you like me
apologies.
would you like me to repeat the question?
No, I actually was going to start off that.
Sure.
I mean, the first question that we're asking, and I think Beth and Kirsten did an excellent job. I just want to fill in a couple of other holes in terms of the state and federal acts or decisions that have negatively impacted families with a lack of compliance or failed implementation. And Beth and Kirsten, thank you so much for giving a very detailed history of Vermont and also the federal rules and regulations. I think there's a couple things that I wanted to talk about in the way that these institutional sanctions have trickled down, and the educator in me is going to put resources in the chat. So this is a piece that I just put in the chat that gives a little bit of history, in part why Faith invited this particular panel, because when we look at truth and reconciliation, the University of Vermont was one of the cornerstones of the eugenics movement. Lots of people were looking at what kind of research, what kind of procedures and policies were happening in this small little state, and taking that on a national level. And then, as we know, was sort of the training ground, if you will, for Nazi Germany. So that is reverberating even now, right? And part of the effort of just eliminating those individuals that are undesirable, that might have cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities, are from a particular class, they are not white, they are Catholic. I mean, the list goes pretty long, right? That history of the eugenics movement and coming up with sort of this pure breed trickles down into a whole bunch of different legislation and acts and policies, right? And so we went from eliminating these populations to warehousing, at least making invisible these populations, right? And that's where we had mental institutions and the Brandon School that both Beth and Kirsten talks about. And in some ways, having supports or having places where adults with disabilities or children with disabilities could actually go on one level is sort of a good idea, right? Especially as Beth has pointed out, as parents are aging or people do not have the capacities, the finances, there's all kinds of pieces that go into staying at home and caring for either an elderly person, a person with disability, a child, right? Like that whole life spectrum. So now we've got this warehousing, which that's not entirely perfect either. And I'm thinking about the Kennedy family that, sent one of their children off and nobody talked about it. So there's all this shame. So then we have this model of inclusion, right? And having community involvement, community presence. I think Vermont is an interesting state. And as Beth pointed out, these rules have changed over time. I'm old enough that I do remember having segregated special education schools and classrooms. So when I had a child with a disability, I was a little taken aback that model didn't exist anymore. But what I noticed is on paper, yes, it looks like it's an inclusion model, but paraeducators are paid poorly. They're often not hired until 2 or 3 days before the school starts, so they may not have any relationship with the child or with the family. They have no training, perhaps, in that child's particular disability. Everything is just in time, or just in case, right? Just in case something happens. So all of these rules and regulations are really set up for a cover your ass instead of what is the best for this child or for this individual or for this family. And that's in some part the nature of bureaucracy, the individual needs definitely gets lost. So now we are in this moment where schools are required to include, the teachers may not be equipped, there's not enough paraeducators, the neurodivergent students aren't getting their needs met, other students aren't getting their needs met. And so what ends up happening is now we've got a situation, and unfortunately Vermont made the news. I'm going to put in the chat another article. The Department of Education last year came out with a study, and are we surprised that restraint and seclusion is actually a common practice that happens in our public schools, particularly for children who have disabilities, particularly children of color who have disabilities, particularly children who happen to be boys who are of color or non-white, and this restraint and seclusion as a consequence of that individual's behaviors in the classroom. And so now we've got, nobody is happy. The students are terrified and traumatized. Faculty or teachers may feel isolated in their classrooms. Parents are horrified hearing that their child is being restrained or secluded. And administrators are either defending their practices, or they perhaps are also ill-equipped. And so that is happening, right? And in some ways, that's a little bit of a pipeline of the larger cultural discussion that was happening in the last couple of years around police brutality, right? There's also, so these individuals that are in elementary schools grow up to be adults, most of them, and there's been lots and lots of scenarios, I'm not going to go into specifics, but where an emergency medical crew may be called in, or the police may encounter someone who is deaf or has cerebral palsy, and instead of identifying that person as someone who has a disability, they assume they're high on crack or are dangerous, right? And so the police brutality towards individuals, again, particularly towards men of color with disabilities, are more likely to be harmed when there is some kind of confrontation. And so that, to me, from a cultural perspective, is looking at those legacies of eugenics and where it plays itself out in 2024. The other piece, and then I'll make sure that we move to the next two questions, is it was only last September in 2023 that the National Institute of Health declared that people with disabilities constitute a health disparity population. 2023, the National Institute of Health finally declared that people with disabilities constitute a health disparity population. And I think that definitely is part of the way ableism works, right? Is that even though there's large amounts of people that are disabled, cognitively disabled, we're invisible, right? And this conversation definitely bubbled up during COVID because people with disabilities were a vulnerable population with this virus, especially at the very early stages of COVID. And so I think that is also interesting, sort of coming to terms with the fact that that people with disabilities, they are part of a health disparity population, as well as an educational disparity population. And there's that push and pull between having the state or the federal government being involved, but then also having a heavy hand where it's really not very patient or student or family centered at all. So there's that constant tension. And I will stop there so that we can move to the second question.
Kirsten, I appreciate the way you named the paradox, I guess is what I see. Being involved and yet it can be supportive and yet also harmful. And also the intersectional piece that you named. Second question. In what ways have the rules of social services, their consistencies and non-compliances or non-compliances of rules harmed families, parents, and guardians? And I know you have, the three of you have sort of referenced social services. So if you feel like you have talked about that enough, we can certainly move on, or you can rephrase the question. but I don't want to lose sight that social service is a big piece.
Do you want me to go first?
Yes, Beth, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Please do.
So the closing of the Brandon Training School created an overreaction, in my opinion, by state social services and their designated agencies when creating rules regarding housing choices for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The state of Vermont has been stuck in the philosophy that the shared living provider model is the best. Certainly the cheapest, but they feel it is the best and are actually seem to be quite proud that they have come up with this model. But it is essentially foster care for adults. Mm-hmm. My son has lived with 2 different shared living providers. Neither of them had any training in caring for an individual on the autism spectrum, had very little supervision or oversight by the designated agency, and neither placement lasted for more than 2 years. Another issue is that many shared living providers live out in the country outside of communities. And oftentimes that results in very limited access to the community. Some people with intellectual and developmental disabilities live in group homes. But again, it's not an ideal setting for many, many people. For one thing, because they have high staff turnover. So the idea of the least restrictive environment, which is long applied to public schools, seems to have been forgotten when it comes to adult living situations. And the reality is, I will say it again, that Vermont relies on the least expensive housing solution for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, either SLPs, shared living providers, or parents and families. That's really cheap. Mentioned the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services that set forth the rules regarding qualities for home and community-based settings for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The overriding theme of these rules is the right of choice. We do not have choice in the state of Vermont. And the right to full access to the greater community. Now, up to now, I've only addressed housing. Kirsten brought in schools, but I also want to address another issue, and that is employment, quality employment for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And one of the problems is that there are very few innovative paths to employment in the state of Vermont. We again seem to be stuck in a one-size-fits-all method for finding employment. Creativity and innovation is lacking, which is a grave disservice to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. This means that, excuse me, the responsibility of finding employment and also finding living situations for these individuals oftentimes falls to the family. In fact, in the state of Vermont, all of the innovative things that you hear that are going on right now in the area of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, all of those initiatives have been started by parents, not by agencies, although some agencies are cooperating. It's parents. Recently, there was a developmental disabilities housing initiative parent group that started a couple of years ago, which was the driving force behind the funding of 3 pilot residential planning grants and a new statute language that prioritizes adults on home and community-based service waivers in the state housing grants. These are plans spearheaded by parents for new intentional communities and apartments designed for individuals with intellectual and developmentally disabled people who need support. These initiatives shouldn't be the sole responsibility of parents. There's also a movement led by parents to train employment specialists at the designated agencies in an innovative process called customized employment. A number of parents actually got trained in this to try to support the designated agencies. There is a grant that fully funds staff from these designated agencies to learn this new innovative approach to help finding employment, meaningful employment to adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And yet there's still pushback. They still don't want to be involved. We don't get it. So I guess that's all I want to say on that topic. I could certainly say a lot more, but I want to leave something for somebody else to say.
I think I'm next on the queue, and I'm going to be really brief here because I see our time. I wanted to follow up on a couple of Kirsten's excellent points. I put a link in the chat because I want people to know that the state of Vermont did publish a very well done research brief demonstrating the health disparities across every major disease that you can think of, showing that Vermonters with disabilities in a variety of types of disabilities have 2 to 2.5 times the rate of people without disabilities. And I would just add that while the feds have now, through the Institute on Health, finally acknowledged the health disparities experienced by people with disabilities. HRSA, the other large federal bureaucracy that controls benefits that would accrue to things like federally qualified health centers when they are serving health disparity groups, has yet to name people with disabilities as a health disparity group. So we're not all the way done with that either. So I wanted to say that I took this question a little bit differently, and I just want to say I kind of focused on the harm experienced by families. And what I wanted to say is that it really harms both the individual and the family and the parent caregivers when somebody lives at home for a prolonged period, way past the age when that is age normative, right? So we frequently see adults living with their parents for long periods of time, and we I will now speak personally. Even the most wonderful parent cannot create the sort of environment that lets a person in their 20s or 30s make mistakes and grow and figure out being an adult. I am a really good parent, but my son had to live on his own and make choices that I would not make before he understood that he has to stand up for himself and advocate that his employer not fire him if he has a seizure at work. And that is in fact discrimination. I'm a really good parent, but if he had lived at home, my son would not have had the experience of having a partner live with him. And I'm a pretty good parent because I moved him across the country and I found a way for him to eventually graduate from college. But I'm also a parent that had resources and privileges that not every parent has. So there are practical problems that come with aging. Parents and family caregivers that continue to provide personal care, transfers, and other services that tax their health. There are opportunity costs. For example, when someone can't go back to work because they need to stay home with their adult daughter or son. And as they age, their parents' ability to go out and engage the community is also compromised. Maybe someone stops driving. I heard a story about a family on the Canadian border recently. The parents have both lost their license, and their son is trapped at home with them. And they're in a really rural area. They never leave the house, right? So, and unhealthy dependence can happen, not necessarily because anybody's means to do it. There are families that depend upon their son or daughter's SSI check. That does happen because people might not have a choice. And to transfer the care back to the state, parents are put in a position of having to lie. What they have to do is tell the state that they're going to kick their son or daughter out. I think that alone is just a really troubling thing that can take a huge toll on a family to put people in that situation. So again, this just isn't good for anyone. And I'll let Kirsten go.
All right, thank you, Kirsten. And Cheryl, I do want to note your comment in the chat that quality care services and supports need to be timely, effective, adequate, and individualized. And I think that's really hard when you're dealing in quantity versus quality, right? So I think when we look at the rules of social services, because that's what this question is asking, the ways that these rules of social services get in the way and can harm families, parents, and guardians. And I think, as I was talking about before, where it used, well, historically, right, we move the undesirables away out of the public eye. What we have now in this sort of neoliberal time is it's very privatized, and unfortunately it's the families that take the burden of the caretaking without compensation, right? And I know that's incredibly controversial because we chose to be parents, and it's our own damn fault if we have a kid with a disability. But I think there is this way that the social contract of taking care of each other has eroded. And when we think about the rules of social services, I joke, I'm the chair of a academic department. Okay, I'm a white woman, I speak English, I'm well educated, and it is fatiguing trying to figure out all the rules and policies and forms that I'm supposed to fill out. And that is incredibly alienating. I mean, how many people don't speak English or may not have a high literacy rate or don't understand the fiscal year that ends in June, right? I mean, there's so many things that there's like a really, really high learning curve. One of the things that has been really problematic for our family is that we have no nurses. We have, because of a workforce shortage, we have social service agencies telling us, okay, you're part of the pediatric palliative care program. It includes a nurse, it includes expressive arts, it includes therapies, it includes all these things on paper, as Kirsten pointed out, to get Medicaid or to get federal funding on paper, they have these opportunities. And yet the reality is there are no nurses. There are very few helpers. The state has basically told our particular family that, yes, if you want to self-manage and you find your own nurse and hire that person, that would then be a contract worker for the state. Yeah, you could get nursing care. It doesn't matter that your insurance covers in-home nursing, right? So that very privatized reality of what's happening with social services. And I know social services, they're underfunded, and there's some very, very well-intentioned, really lovely people that have come in and out of our lives, because it is definitely a revolving door, which is also incredibly exhausting. But for us, I think that the way that the rules of, like, when we have to hand in timesheets or when we have to file for this particular benefit, or if we want to get these particular services, it's overwhelming, and it adds to our caretaker fatigue. And as Kirsten often says, having to parse out, what do I need to know and what's nice to know, and the burden of parents and families needing to navigate that is very tiresome and really problematic. Going back to also what Kirsten had talked about, I just spoke with a family member this weekend of an adult child with autism who is big and can sometimes be violent and sometimes is very scary. And this mother was feeling very, very alienated and isolated and not having a whole lot of supports when her own child was physically being abusive. And who do you call? If you call adult children's or adult services, who's being protected? And it's more, yeah, there's not a whole lot of resources for families like that. So that's my convoluted answer to that second question.
Thank you for that answer, Kirsten and Beth. It's the personalization hits differently. And so I appreciate your willingness to dive into that. I'm really excited to bring the community into. Let's get to our last question and then we'll get to our community. Um, what are the responsibilities of the state of Vermont when the rules of engagement, I really like that term, and Kirsten, you might have mentioned this, you might have used that term, when the rules of engagement are at a disservice to families. So what are the responsibilities of the state of Vermont? That's the main question.
My answer to this is pretty short. I just think it's time for the state of Vermont to incentivize designated agencies to be more innovative in solutions, whether it's for housing, whether it's staffing, whether it's employment. Innovation is not encouraged, it is not incentivized. And I think that would be a really great place to start. Don't rely on the parents to come up with all the innovations and then try to get the designated agencies to follow along. So what's the state going to do when the baby boomer parents die, move into nursing home? What's going to happen? What is the state going to do with all of these people? So that's all I'd like to say.
Very briefly, I believe Vermont has an obligation, moral, practical, financial, legal, to revisit its Olmsted plan and to develop a roadmap for the creation of a care infrastructure, including housing, transportation, and services that make authentic community living a reality for every Vermonter with a disability. Whether we're talking about someone with a disability or somebody without a disability. I have a third child, didn't happen to have a disability. Parents and guardians do a tremendous amount during that person's childhood and adolescence and their launch into adulthood. But at some point, that person is an adult citizen of Vermont, and as such, they have a right to live separate from their parents and to be supported to fully engage and to get back to their community. End of story.
Thank you, Kristen. Kirsten, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be using my personal example here. When we think about the state of Vermont's responsibilities of serving families, so we have a workforce shortage, as we were talking about. We have one of the oldest aging populations in the country also. So we've got lots of changing demographics, and there's a lot of people that are being underserved, not just adults with disabilities, right? So I agree with Beth, coming up with something innovative. And one of the conversations that's been happening within, families with disabilities is compensating caretakers. And again, I know this could be incredibly controversial, but thinking about, okay, we don't have any nurses. We have very few LNAs. It's really hard to find personal care assistants, and the onus is on the family. So is there a way that we could set up something? Right now, the only thing that Vermont has is if you yourself are a registered nurse, you can get paid by the state to care for your own child, right? But how many of us are nurses? And are there ways that we can think of, are there other ways that we can compensate or make sure that that families are being served and being supported, and that people are part of the larger community?
Kirsten, can I just say that I moved here from another state where parents were paid. Mm-hmm. It is not something that is outside the scope of what could happen. It is happening other places.
Right.
But and in that state, the parents were in charge of the budgets. They could move money around. So it's not that it's never been done. It has been done.
Yes.
And it is being done.
Yeah.
Beth, can you give us an example of one of those states, if you don't mind?
I lived in Minnesota.
Minnesota. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that. Y'all no moving now.
I tell you, there are times when I wonder if that's the only solution is to move.
Okay. Thank you for saying that, Beth. Yeah. I would love to open this up to the community. If you have a question, please raise your hand or you can put it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you.
I think Kalani has a question.
Go for it.
Okay, here we go. So I wanted to address the question about harm and specifically to Kristen Murphy. So my brother is neurodivergent and was actually diagnosed with dyslexia when he was a child, which my mom had to fight extremely hard for. Uh, he was considered dangerous, and through oversight from the school, he was put into an institution in Winooski,
Mhm.
which was extremely harmful for him.
Yeah.
Sorry if I get emotional. Uh, so he's been troubled his whole life, and he's never recovered. He has PTSD, and he struggles daily. I was just wondering, like, do you know if there are any Vermont programs out there that can help him, like help him get therapy or help him, recover with
Yeah.
like daily living or I don't know, even like reparations?
Kalani, I first want to say I'm really sorry that that happened to your family and especially that that happened to your brother. Um, this isn't probably the best place for me to counsel you on resources. I'm going to give you my email and I'd like us to chat over email about what might be available to you. But that's a really heart-wrenching story. And I wish that that young man had had better support. I'm going to type my email into the chat now for you, okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here, Kalani, and asking your question. It's good to have that connection with Kirsten. Other questions? I'm going to go to the chat just to see if there's anything coming through. And just know I can't notice everyone's hands. So if you are raising your hand, feel free to unmic and you can manage yourself.
Faith,
Yes,
I will go ahead and ask a question.
please do.
This is Mia. Thank you again. This has been truly enlightening. And there's a lot of themes that we see that are common among the groups we are serving in this commission. And as you may know, our scope is pretty broad. And it encompasses many groups of people who have been historically and currently are marginalized by the state of Vermont laws and policies. Knowing this, we understand that even within the communities that we are um, examining and looking at, that their communities are broad as well. There's intersections within disability, for example. There's a lot of people who have different types of disabilities. Can you kind of speak to any of the other sorts of stories that you might know from other folks who have mental families with families of people who have mental illness, for example? Kirsten talked about some of the intersectionality that you see some things happening. I would love to, discuss that a little bit further and talk about like other stories that you might have with different groups of people.
So a story comes to my mind, and I'm going to be very careful to do this in a way that masks the identity of the person. This is a person who came up through the state, DCF system, a person with a disability and also mental health concerns, because those happen. People with disabilities have mental health, and sometimes it's not well. And this is a person who's African American. And one of the most upsetting stories I've watched during this past year in the face of a workforce crisis and in the face of, frankly, stretching our shared living situations to accept people as providers that we might not have thought were appropriate in the past. This particular individual who fears being homeless, fears the fact that she doesn't have a family, fears that she will be put out, found that the only way to leave the living situation she had, because it was not appropriate, and I had done enough home visits to know it was not appropriate, was to go to the emergency room and say she was suicidal, may have been, I don't know, no judgment there, but they had no place to send her. So she spent a month in the emergency room, not a bed in the hospital, the emergency room. And she was sent back to an inappropriate situation. So she engaged in some very dangerous behavior that would have put herself at risk and went back to the emergency room for another month. And they still could not find a psychiatric bed that would take someone with her nursing needs. So they put her up in a downtown hotel in Burlington with a round-the-clock provider. What? That's not community. That's just a room in a hotel. And the hotel eventually needed the room and threw her out. That is just such a blatant system failure of somebody living at the intersection with many disadvantageous identities. And the trauma that experience has created for this individual will take many years to undo. So that's a story.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Other questions? Or Kirsten and Beth, if you wanted to respond to Commissioner Schultz's question as well, please. Please feel free to add. I do see comments just acknowledging.
Beth, I think you
Will
might have to come
say,
up. There you go.
yeah, I tried and I couldn't do it. So I will say that people with mental illness, there are also a lot of people with dual diagnoses. Not only do they have a developmental disability, but they also have a secondary mental illness diagnosis. My son happens to be one of those. And he lived in a group home for a while. And we tried to get the staff training for how to deal with him, how to de-escalate. The staff turnover was so high that even the limited training they got, I mean, with some staff, he was great. And with some other staff, whenever he would have an issue, it would escalate. There was another individual who lived there who was very loud. And my son is autistic and he has a secondary diagnosis of schizophrenia. This other person was very, very loud. And it got to the point where my son was having hallucinations. He tried to climb out a window in the middle of the night. We were called and said, you got to take him to the emergency room. Get to the emergency room. There's nothing they can do. I have a friend who's an ER doctor who said it's a good thing they did admit him, because if they admitted him, he would have been there for months. So what ended up happening is that his psychiatrist said, you have to bring him home. You can't let him stay there. It's too stressful. He now is doing great. He's on good medication. His stress level is down because he's at home, but that's not great. He doesn't want to be at home. He wants to live in an apartment. But we just couldn't, we could have made it work had there been enough training, had they made some accommodations, moved the person that was so loud to a different part. But the end result was there was no place for him to go. And if we hadn't taken him in, he would have been homeless. So mental illness is, if there's, I won't say it's worse than having a developmental disability, but it's a very, very difficult thing to deal with. And especially if you have a developmental disability and you don't even understand your mental illness, it's even worse.
Thank you, Beth. I'm hearing the, just the intensity of it being compounded and the lack of services, the lack of support for families. That's real. That's real. Other questions? Maybe one or two more. So we do have a comment by Don Peabody. I can read it. I will. Don, I hope that's okay. So lots of questions, but mostly want to recognize, honor, thank you three for being so cogent regarding problems that I only know about because of my friendship with love of two families. And then they named the family members. The love and care you're given your children, and because of all this, all of that, us all moves me immensely. I hope that the problematic solutions you all have spoken of are passed around so the rest of us can take action supportive of you and yours. And then there's a quote in here, the quote erosion of the social fabric, unquote, and the quote breach of the social contract, unquote, are larger issues that most of my friends and their children continue to work on. Thank you so much, Don.
I see a hand from Patricia Fontaine.
Ah, hi, Patricia. Please. Let's see if I can unmute you for you. Oh, nope. Ah,
There we go.
there you go.
Thank you all so much, Faith, for your beautiful facilitation and for all of you for everything that you've shared, including our guests as well. And I'm always curious for folks who are working at the edges of something that is so difficult and so complex. How do you care for yourselves? What nourishes you? What resources do you turn to?
Beth will tell on me that I don't do nearly enough of that.
Yeah, you don't. Yeah. This is, unfortunately, this is Kirsten's job. And so she's always in the weeds and doesn't take vacation when she should. I have two other children that live close by who are wonderful people, and I have 5 grandchildren that live close by. And actually, my son who lives with us loves having his nieces and nephews come over, so that's great. But beyond that, I do yoga. I meet with other parents. I try to get things going. I actually have a group of parents that are meeting in Addison County right now and meeting with our designating agency to try to do some innovation in terms of housing. And we see there might be a way forward on that. So you just, since I'm retired, it's a little easier for me. When I was working, well, I'll tell you this, when my son came home to live with us, I retired. That's when I retired. I had to. I couldn't keep working. I don't know how Kirsten does it with working at the level that you do.
she surrounds herself with fantastic people, right, Kirsten?
That's very true.
Well, I meant you,
And she
the
met
other
you.
Kirsten.
Oh,
Yeah,
See, that's the
yeah.
confusion we run into.
So, I do. I think this is a great question, and I think it's a very gendered question, right? Because so much of caretaking does fall on women in our culture. My family is unique in that my male partner has been the stay-at-home dad, at the expense of his own, career pursuits. And I think as I'm getting older, really thinking about what self-care looks like. One of my favorite quotes is from the poet Audre Lorde, that caring for ourselves is not self-indulgent, but it's self-preservation and an act of political warfare. And, thinking about, I had to unmute myself because I have my two lovely dogs playing like crazy at my feet, right? Like that brings me joy. Realizing that there's some fights that just aren't worth fighting for. Sitting at the table of a lot of the boards and advisory councils that I've been on with the state, and kind of looking around and realizing some of these people had been fighting the same fight for decades. And in some ways, the system is just waiting for those individuals to die out and the problems persist, right? So I think for me, it really is trying to figure out how agitated do I want to get about these systems that sometimes take a really long time to change, and what is within my sphere of influence. In some ways, for us, COVID was absolutely lovely because the rest of the world got to live like we were living, very, isolated and constantly worried that my daughter's immune system was going to be compromised. And for a while, it actually felt like, oh, people understand what it's like to have a disability. And that very shortly, went away. But yeah, I think it's an ongoing, yeah, for me, it's really challenging, thinking about what self-care is. And I think that idea of self-care somehow, that it's like bubble baths and painting your nails, when it's really, you've got these systems that are wearing you down every day, and trying to navigate that. I think, I don't know, Patricia, that's such a great question. And of course you would ask that question. And I think that's lovely. I would love to tell you that I've been like journaling every day, but I stopped doing that because I got bored because I was telling the same story every day. So sorry, I did
You
this.
know, I think that one of the difficult things is that you feel so alone. People don't really want to hear about your child with a disability. And so if you can have a parent group, Kristen Murphy did that for me when she put together the group being trained in customized employment. We still meet and get together and support each other because honestly, people just want to talk about all the successes of their kids. They don't want to hear about the tough stuff.
Kirsten, can you address this question that's in the chat? I feel like you're the best person that you could address this. And then I realized that we're at 6:30, but
Can you read the question because I'm not seeing it?
yeah. It says, so this is from Claire. When agencies and regulators assess our state's performances of care delivery, are the persons who are directly providing care for individuals being surveyed and listened to for their insights and perspectives on the practices of their providing organization? Are there direct care professionals included in designing these system processes?
So, the answer is yes, but not enough. So first off, I have a colleague that refers to Vermont as a data-free environment. So, um,
Right?
that is a real stumbling block for us in advancing better
Yep.
policy. But there are, there's always a committee for everything in Vermont, and they do often include providers and even direct support providers, providers for frontline workers. And that's really helpful, although they should be better compensated for the time they're spending doing that kind of systems change work. Um, but at the same time, is there, really great qualitative data or data that relies on talking to recipients of service, families, and frontline providers to take their, actual answers to, how are you experiencing this, that, and the other thing? Are we authentically integrating people into the community? And there's really, really good tools to do that. And Vermont has refused to use them for quite a while now.
Thank you so much for being here, community, and also, of course, highest praise to our panelists, Beth Davis, Kirsten Murphy, Kirsten Isgro. Before we end, though, and my gratitude will continue to go on and on, I would like to just gesture to the commissioners in case they would like to offer a wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just say again, thank you for this profound experience. And also just like to call everybody in who has stories to visit our website, to sign up, to get involved, to tell your story if you need to, or if you don't have a story to tell, to get involved in this really important work. It's historic work and it's temporary. And at the end of this, we are going to be giving a list or a book, hopefully, of recommendations for our legislators. So when I hear people say, what can we do about it? This is what we can do about it here through the Truth and Reconciliation. We hope to be able to get this information, learn from the experts, the people who are on the ground doing the work, and take their expertise to the legislature. So really important to get involved in this so that we can bring that, close the gaps that we see here. So again, thank you so much for being part of this. It was really deeply a deep honor to get to know you today.
Yeah, I am very thoroughly impressed by everyone and all you had to say. And I'm not going to say any more because it's 6:34 and I want to make sure everyone goes and does what they need to do. But thank you so much. Very heartfelt thank you. It was wonderful. I learned a lot.
And Eric and Hannah, thank you so much to our ASL interpreters. Appreciate you so much. And thank you, community.
One
Beth,
other thing, Kaylani was asking Beth about your group. So if you can connect your group yes, she's in Virginia.
Okay.
I want to make sure Kaylani got help.
I didn't see that.
Okay.
let's see, Beth. It is a question. I think it had to do with Addison County. Hold on, let me think. Where'd it go?
Yeah, there was one other what agency in Addison County, because she's in Virginia. If there was a group that you talked about, Beth, that
Yeah,
meets.
I'm looking to see, was this in the chat?
Yes, it was. It was
at 6:26.
up there from Kalani.
Well, Kalani, I'll look forward to connecting with you tomorrow.
Okay, so Kirsten's going to connect, and maybe you can give her the information.
Yeah, we'll work that out. Maybe
We'll
I'll
work it all out. Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure
Okay.
everybody's connected and
Yeah.
taken care of.
Oh,
Thank
I
you
see
so
it.
much.
I see it right now. Is she still on?
Yes, she's here. She's still here.
Okay, I will answer her.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks a lot.
Night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.